Walt Disney World is a wonderful sight full of many amazing things, but that does not mean it is without its faults. While Disney World does far from everything perfectly, there is arguably one matter that stands above all other problems. Disney World has forever been missing something. A fundamental piece of the puzzle that would make the entire vision a masterpiece, the penultimate and most defining note in a symphony authored by and honoring the man, Walt Disney. It's time. This is why Walt Disney World needs a polar bear.
Sister, once again it was just like you explained. He stood there in front of me, larger than life. He followed my face as I neared closer. I reached out and laid my palm upon his nape. I grasped a cusp of fur. It was cool to the touch, but also warm, welcoming. He turned to me and I peered deep into the raven pools that were his eyes. I found myself lost, blank, free of gladness, sadness, and doubt. A man and a polar bear, two meandering souls found in a lost white wilderness. He opened his mouth as if to speak, and I awoke. I suppose you are right. His time is approaching, sister. I just hope mine doesn't come first. Yours, Walter.
There are few certainties in life, but one truth that is undisputed is Walt Disney's extraordinary fondness and enthusiasm for polar bears. While Walt dabbled in various pastimes like polo, trains, and city planning, those who knew him best knew his fiercest interest lied firmly with the polar bear. The polar bear, indigenous to the Earth's most frigid and pristine environments, is a regal creature renowned for its agreeable sensibilities. Polar bears often evoke reverence and wonder in those who have the courage to pursue them. While some bears weigh in at 1,000 pounds and others reach heights of 2 to 6 meters, polar bears perhaps weighed heaviest and soared highest in the eyes of Walt Disney, who throughout his sweeping career had ever dreamed of exploiting his influence to further the polar bear, whether it be through the colors of the screen or the physical truth of his theme parks. Since Walt Disney World opened in 1971, polar bears have had a presence within the parks, but nothing to the degree that Walt had originally designed. Given negligible effort from time to time, polar bears in the parks have been fully relegated to cheesy CGI images or bumbling animatronics. This is not the way. In Walt Disney World, the Magic Kingdom boasts a full-on attraction dedicated to bears, and yet a polar bear has only been depicted for a season of time. And if you study the lore, which I have extensively, there's grounds to believe it's just a country bear pretending to be a polar bear, which is really messed up. You've probably forgotten about the polar bears in Walt Disney World, and honestly, I don't even blame you. Disney has made a pitiful effort to keep Walt's polar bear dream alive. This has to stop. Disney World needs a polar bear, and no, not more of these sad excuses for polar bears. No, a genuine, breathing, tried and true life, sympathetic, sociable polar bear. We can't dilly-dally any longer because this is what Walt wanted. When Walt was a boy, his sister Eliza would frequently tell him the famous fable of Bergen the bear. Bergen the bear was a popular character in Scandinavian folklore, which carried strong roots within the Disney family. The story had been passed down through many generations of Scandinavia, and Bergen's adventures were constantly being reshaped and repurposed, as with each retelling, the world of Bergen the bear would broaden and develop. Walt had heard several iterations of Bergen's tales throughout his boyhood, but he liked the way his sister Arlene told it best. The general essence of the Bergen the Bear stories would recount how he spent his days frolicking along the legendary fjords of Ivar and the deep forests of the Nordic wilderness. He would often share his escapades with a mute but wildly precocious goldfish named Gunder. Bergen played somewhat of a foil to Gunder's loony antics. Together they would wander the countryside, usually getting into unique kinds of trouble, but often learning valuable lessons along the way. Walt's favorite Bergen the Bear story was the one his sister Joanna would tell. It began with the goldfish Gunder telling to Bergen the legend of a towering magical tree deep within the woods. If those who found it could climb to the top, the tree would grant them a special wish. The story sees them journeying through the forest, each with a particular wish in mind, hoping to become true once they make it to the top. Of course, as various adventures and side stories unfold along the way, their generally selfish wishes transform into different things. At one point, Bergen plans to wish for all the crowberries in the forest, to which he'll invite every animal there to a giant banquet. Gunder wishes to learn the most beautiful song in the world so he can sing it loudly and bring joy to his village. After a long trek, Bergen and Gunder ultimately find the tree and start the climb up, but it becomes much more of a challenge than either of them had expected. Bergen keeps tumbling down, Gunder can't hang on. When it seems like they're destined to give up, Bergen, disheartened, throws his paws up in the air and frustratedly shouts, "I only wish to get to the top of the tree." The tree hears this, and magically, Bergen and Gunder are perched upon the top of the tree, seeing the breathtaking Arctic sunset, the vast fjords and mountain ranges around them. "This is even better than what I thought I wanted to wish for," Bergen says reflectively. "But most of all, because I got to wish it with you." To which Gunder adds, "You're my best friend, Bergen the bear, and friendship is a wish come true." Walt cherished the way his sister Caroline told the stories, and she would always say, "But Walt, you're the most creative of all, and someday you're gonna tell it the best way." And Walt believed her. Walt, as a young man, would soon kick off his animation studio and expected it would be the ideal avenue to prove his sister Polly right and bring a series of powerful animated Bergen the Bear adventures to the American public. The normally supportive Roy Disney was hesitant, though, and offered, "Kid, I love Ellen's stories more than anyone, but the world just isn't ready for animated polar bears. And honestly, kid, you're not very good at drawing bears. Maybe we should start with something smaller." Walt was disappointed, but he valued his brother as a business associate and a friend and knew the time for his Bergen story would come soon. In lieu of Bergen, Walt developed Oswald, a lucky rabbit. But Oswald brought little in the way of luck to Walt, and difficulties he created would force Walt into conceiving another animated character. This was Bergen's time, Walt believed, but in collaborating with fellow animator Ub Iwerks to develop the character, another problem unfortunately surfaced. Ub Iwerks had a devastating phobia of bears. The mere idea of bears alone would send him into crippling fits of anxiety. He would not see films with bears or even look at newspapers that had photos of bears inside. Walt appreciated the man and his abilities and reluctantly tried to identify an alternate approach. Together, they ultimately settled on a mouse named Mickey, a persona that Walt would eventually grow to love. But still, for Walt, the polar bear beckoned. It represented the best of storytelling, the power of the imagination, and friendship. And now the beast of the animated Hollywood machine. While Mickey Mouse succeeded, Walt vowed to bring Bergen and a story of nuance to life somehow, ideally via the whimsical animation that he had been required to originally imagine him in. But most days, he worried if Bergen's story would ever be told. After the financial triumph of Snow White, Walt saw another window of opportunity. He would take no excuses this time and would force development of his Bergen picture. The Disney Studios began early production on a slew of diverse feature-length projects: Pinocchio, Fantasia, and Bergen, an animated collection of colorful vignettes featuring a young polar bear in the Arctic wilderness. Walt brought a polar bear to the studio so his artists could begin perfecting their polar bear drawing techniques. These studies proceeded well enough for about a week until the studio was mysteriously and quietly shut down for several days. When the studios reopened the following Wednesday, the number of persons on payroll had fallen by 2. While the internet pushes a ludicrous theory here, this is likely due to a creative dispute between animators. Unexplainably, however, the in-development story of Bergen the bear had been completely abandoned, and an adapted story of a deer called Bambi and his bunny Buddy Thumper became comparable characters in a much simpler story that would ultimately delight millions in the coming years. Walt's plight for Bergen the bear seemed to end there, as he would seldom bring him up again, but Walt was forever changed when the polar bear came to the studio. Something had shifted within him after having witnessed a polar bear in the flesh. While the Bergen stories would wane in his mind, Walt's appreciation and passion for real-life polar bears never ceased to thrive. He now sensed animation would be a disservice to the majestic creatures he revered, and Walt silently pledged somehow, some way, he would make them known. In 1958, Walt finally had his wish and was able to observe the polar bears in the wild during the filming of the true-life adventure, White Wilderness. Walt had established True Life Adventures out of a genuine desire to see new peoples and places and the exotic wildlife that abounded around the world, but the long-term objective was ultimately for Walt to eventually go and see the polar bears himself, and at long last he was able to do that. It was an emotional experience for him, and while he was eager to bring their plight to screens around the world, Walt himself wanted to be able to personally chase that affecting polar bear feeling a little closer to home. "I want my guests in Disneyland to see them," producer Herb Waller recalls Walt telling him. "I need them to get close. I want them to look into their eyes and recognize what I've seen." It seemed impractical, but Walt was adamant. He'd say, "I built Disneyland, haven't I? I can make a polar bear house work." So when he returned to California, he quickly initiated efforts to establish a polar bear habitat in Disneyland, but naturally the municipality of Anaheim vehemently shut it down. Apparently Knott's Berry Farm had tried to do something similar with a set of koala bears in the 1940s, and it was just this whole thing. So yeah, they said no to any future bear dwellings within the city. And now where what could have been the residence to a polar bear stands the Matterhorn bobsled. So this setback only encouraged Walt, though, and it bolstered him to look for other areas in which he could bring the polar bear to his audience in a Walt Disney kind of way. As Walt researched with his team, he found the answer in Florida. Florida, with its many amenities and resources, would be the perfect climate for polar bears, and so it was agreed. Disney discreetly began acquiring up plots of land to one day serve as the world's premium polar bear experience. But again, local government didn't go for it, so Walt conceded with city officials that if he could have his polar bears, he would also construct a theme park to bring more tourism to the area. As a direct result of this exchange, Walt would craft the Reedy Creek Improvement District as a sneaky way to future-proof local interference and secure polar bears within Disney's unique jurisdiction. In reality, Walt Disney World was set up to explicitly cater to polar bear maintenance. The Improvement District was established during the design of Walt Disney World to more easily set the stage for Walt's future city, Epcot. It would have been a fully thriving township, but in actuality, Epcot was merely the guise for a revolutionary and state-of-the-art polar bear habitat. If you look at Article 4, subsection 27 of the Reedy Creek Improvement District bylaws, you'll notice that if adequate care, freeholds, and support is applied, housing with a temperature-based ursine focus can and/or should be established and maintained without regional restriction. Understand this. Disney World could bring in a polar bear today and would not have to jump over any kind of obstacles that Floridian bureaucracy might attempt to throw at them. While Walt envisioned a thriving and futuristic polar bear community, the truth was he couldn't do it by himself, and he had hoped that if he couldn't, there would be droves of dedicated advocates to fight for the dream when he was gone. But sadly, the goal of a functioning Epcot City died with Walt, and with it went the greater hopes of his innovative polar bear initiative. When pressed about it in 1978, subsequent Disney CEO Carden Walker would tell the Tampa Bay Times, "The city wasn't practical. Corporation would have been a huge issue, but the polar bears was even more silly. I love Walt, but he was a nut with those polar bears. I'll attempt Epcot, so help me, but I'd be pleased if I never had to hear about the polar bears ever again." Epcot opened in 1982 without polar bears, and it struggled severely. Walker's eventual replacement, Michael Eisner, talked of furthering Walt's polar bear visions during his changeover into CEO, but if proof is in the pudding, we can see that those promises carried little substance. Eventually, Epcot's World Showcase would expand with the addition of a Norway pavilion, and Eisner lacklusterly pushed for some kind of polar bear presence there. Deals were made with the understanding that an encounter with living polar bears would be a major part of the planned e-tickets finale. But as plans furthered, an overall impression developed from Norwegian emissaries that the real estate the Norway attraction offered would not be sufficient to house the 1 to 3 polar bears that were originally imagineered for the space. Eisner and Disney did not fight back, and so focus on the Maelstrom and surrounding pavilion was redirected more towards the trolls of Norwegian folklore rather than the current beauty of Norway's reality. Michael Eisner appeared committed to finding a place for Walt's polar bears in the parks, but action proved hollow as his ultimate agenda seemed to be geared more towards pushing entirely new parks instead. So rather than a state-of-the-art polar bear exposition, we got simplistic and pedestrian additions like Disney MGM Studios and the Animal Kingdom. And to be fair, polar bears would make little to no thematic sense in either of those parks. And that brings us to today, a Disney World relentlessly evolving but still stale and without a soul-stirring polar bear attraction. We look at the ashes of what Epcot is today, and it's tough not to ask if this is just karma for the flagrant ignorance of Walt's most hardest fought but ultimately unfulfilled dream. Walt new. Polar bears are noble and venturesome, and they definitely don't sacrifice affection for responsibility. The polar bear is the obvious ingredient for a flailing vacation kingdom. It's time we let polar bears become the keepers of Epcot, honorable guardsmen who will keep the dream of Walt Disney World alive. This is what Walt wanted, and as we look at that vacant crater that now sits in the middle of Epcot, can we finally commit to breathe honest life into the area? Disney has announced an Epcot overhaul and have declared that a good chunk of what was formerly Future World will now be designated as World Nature, and yet, from the concept art we've seen, there is no hint of the true pillars of nature anywhere. There are no polar bears to be found. Put a polar bear here. I'm for real. There needs to be a polar bear here. Guests everywhere of all shapes, creeds, backgrounds, whether they like The Office or God forbid they don't, they all want to come to Epcot. They want to ride Spaceship Earth, and then they want to take a selfie with a polar bear, a real life polar bear. I want a picture of a polar bear, but not just any polar bear, a polar bear that I saw at Epcot. I'm sorry. It's just, we give so much of our focus, so much of our adoration to Mickey Mouse, who's a great guy. I'm not going to take anything away from him. He's earned his keep. I love Runaway Railway, but as the old adage goes, polar bears are just mice with bigger hearts. And even if it's only symbolically, we need to tell Bergen's story, because that's what Walt wanted. We need to get a living polar bear in Disney World, because it's what Walt would have wanted. I mean, if we had a polar bear, who knows where we'd be? And I guess if we can't have a polar bear, a Journey into Imagination reverb would be nice. Until next time, we'll see you in the happy place. Bye.